Welcome to episode 259 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about Oscar Peterson's album from 1963, Night Train. And this is a Book of the Month Club release from their music division. And it also has some of the most pompous liner notes I've ever read. The past is hidden somewhere outside the realm, beyond the reach of the intellect, wrote Proust. It begins and goes on to point out that the playing here deliberately challenges the russet glow of fond reminiscence. So, be that as it may, in terms of what to expect, this is one of Peterson's more popular releases. It's the record which encouraged Diana Krall to start playing jazz piano. It's also the record which apparently inspired Linda May Han-Oh to pick up the acoustic bass, so not a bad set of recommendations. Peterson himself is one of the great jazz piano players of all time. He was a committed traditionalist all the way through the 1950s, 1960s, and 70s at a time of enormous change in other areas of jazz, but that doesn't mean he was stodgy, even if he was often playing standards. He had a fan club which extended to the more avant-garde circles of jazz, yes, because of his technical brilliance, which is always on display, but also because of the feel that he brought to his playing. And it's really his skills and sensitivity as an interpreter of other people's music which ensure his place in the jazz canon. Oscar Peterson was born in Montreal in October 1925. His parents were immigrants from the West Indies. His dad worked for the Canadian Pacific Railroad as a porter and was also an amateur musician. While Peterson was growing up, the family lived in the Little Burgundy neighborhood of Montreal, which was a mostly black neighborhood. His early teaching was mostly in classical music, but Peterson loved jazz and he loved ragtime, he loved boogie-woogie piano, and one of his great early influences was the great Art Tatum. At age 14 in 1940, he wins a national competition for young musicians sponsored by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. On the strength of that, he abandons all his other studies, drops out of school, and gets his first professional gig with the Johnny Holmes Orchestra. By 1945, at age 20, he was leading his own trio, and he was also recording for RCA Victor. And in this period, starting in 1948, he releases 6 different singles for RCA, including his first ever composition recorded and released, which was Oscar's Boogie. It's at this point that Norman Granz, who's a key figure in Peterson's life story, enters the picture. Granz, of course, is famous for being a record exec. He's also a producer on a huge number of the records that his labels put out. But before all that, and probably the reason for which he's best known, is his work as an impresario, starting with Jazz at the Philharmonic in 1944, which is originally a concert at the Philharmonic in Los Angeles, but then becomes a series of tours of leading jazz musicians, taking them out of New York and LA and Philly and places where you could hear a lot of jazz by people who lived there, and out into the broader, wider world where people who couldn't normally hear their jazz heroes live could hear them in these big tours. And he had people like Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald and Dizzy Gillespie and all kinds of other folks on these tours. As a consequence of this work, Granz pretty soon had an amazing network, and 2 of his artists with whom he worked regularly, Coleman Hawkins and Billy Strayhorn, had been telling him in the late 40s again and again about this great young piano player in Montreal. At one point, Granz actually hears Peterson play in a club in 1946 in Montreal, but he's not that impressed, and as he confesses, he forgets about him. A couple of years later, he's in a cab driving to the Montreal airport, and there's a performance on the radio, a live performance from a club, of Peterson and his trio playing at the Alberta Lounge in Montreal. And Grant says to the driver, "Turn around, I want to go meet this guy." They meet, they hit it off, and Grant said to him, "Why don't you come and play on my Jazz at the Philharmonic tours?" Peterson says, "No thanks, I don't think I'm quite ready." But Grant doesn't give up, and he says, "Well, will you come down and appear at Carnegie Hall? I'm doing a concert down there. Come on as a special guest." So on September 18th, 1949, that's the actual date, Grant actually gets it wrong on the liner notes to the live album that comes from this concert. Peterson shows up at this Jazz at the Philharmonic concert. Grant has paired him up with the bassist Ray Brown. They'd never met before, let alone played together, and they absolutely tear it up and bring the house down, which, of course, I think if you're playing Carnegie Hall's first time together as a duo, it's a pretty good first gig. The connections that Peterson made then were to last a long time. Grant becomes his manager and remained his manager and his producer through much of his career. And the connection, as I mentioned, that he had with Brown on stage was pretty instant and very successful. And they stayed together as performers for many years to follow, first as a duo and then increasingly as a trio, sometimes as a quartet. When they did begin to integrate other artists into their sound, it tended to be guitarists like Irving Ashby, who had played guitar with Nat King Cole previously. Peterson and Brown also worked with a number of other guitarists, people like Herb Ellis and Barney Kessel. But over time, Kessel begins to tire of the grind. He starts to move out of the picture, and by the later 1950s, Ellis is basically monopolizing the guitar chair in the trio. The professionalism of all these players and Peterson's tight connection to Grant's meant that they appear on all manner of records in the 1950s, a lot of their own records, but even more as the effective house band of Verve. This meant a lot of work as sidemen, but it also meant that Peterson would often co-lead collaborations with other leading players. My favorite of these is actually from 1957, which is Stan Getz and the Oscar Peterson Trio. Another from that era, which is just a trio, the Ellis version of the trio, is On the Town from 1958. And that's also the last record that Ellis does with the trio, because in 1958 he then leaves to go and work with Ella Fitzgerald and also spend more time in LA working on soundtracks and session work. Peterson decides to freshen up the sound by not bringing in another guitarist to replace Ellis, but instead by bringing in a drummer. So he brings in Ed Thigpen. Now, Thigpen was younger than Peterson, but he was already an established jazz musician. He'd played a lot at the Savoy in the 1950s, in the waning days of that great establishment. He'd also spent the previous 3 years as the drummer for piano player Billy Taylor. With Thigpen on board, in 1959, Peterson takes his trio into the studio no fewer than 16 times to record records for Verve. But as the 1960s dawned, Peterson then begins to dial back his studio output, begins to focus more, not exclusively, but more on his own compositions, and also begins to draw on more eclectic influences in composing the track lists for his records. Of the records which feature his own compositions from the early 1960s, you could talk about Blues Etude or the well-known Canadiana Suite, which is actually all his own work, but those are preceded by this record, which comes out pretty much at the height of the US Civil Rights Movement in 1963. This record is recorded December 15th and 16th, 1962. The producer, inevitably, is Norman Granz. The trio, Thigpen on drums, Brown on bass, and Peterson on piano, are intact. It's recorded at some studio in Los Angeles. It's not clear from the liner notes or from any other research I can do where it is. With one exception, it's all standards, and without overdoing this part of the analysis, you can definitely detect a subtle theme of civil rights coming through a number of the selections on the record. You get this vibe not just from the sublime final track, but also, I think, from the selection of Night Train, which, of course, James Brown had just covered and made a real R&B standard in the previous year, Georgia on My Mind, and also, I think, from the dedication of the record to his father, who had been a porter on the railways for many years, which I think is kind of evocative. Side one starts with the title track, Night Train, and this version is luxurious. It's a first-class ride. It's quite different from James Brown's version. There's also a very big sound, in large part due to Thigpen's heavy use of his ride cymbal, which you get all the way through this record, or at least most of the way through the record. It creates a much larger sound than you would expect a trio to come up with. Ellington's Sea Jam Blues follows. This is a joyous performance, and Peterson's playing is in the spotlight from the very start. He then follows that by showing off his mastery of the blues on Georgia on My Mind. Bag's Groove, which had been made famous by Miles Davis, is another much more mellowed out version of an edgier original. The spotlight here is back on Brown's bass and on Peterson's careful dissection of the head arrangement. Mote and Swing has some great brushwork from Thigpen, who was a master at that. This swings like a mother. And Easy Does It, as the title suggests, is a smooth exit from the first side. Side 2 starts with Honey Dripper, which is a welcome change of pace. It's an upbeat, rapid-fire blues, really driven on hard by Peterson's rhythm work in his left hand. Things Ain't What They Used to Be, of course, is an Ellington standard. Duke used to kind of race through this. Oscar plays it as a slow blues, really appealing version. And that leads into a second Ellington tune, one of the real highlights of this record, I Got It Bad and That Ain't Good. This is gorgeous, it's emotional, the trio totally takes its time. And then following that, and completing a trio of Ellington numbers, a really percussive version of Band Call. And now we come with the last track to what is, I think, indisputably the highest point in this record, and one of the great moments in Peterson's career, which is Hymn to Freedom. This is the sole original on the record. It's his tribute to the civil rights movement in the United States. And he injects so much feel, so much gospel feel into every single bar of this recording. Enormous dynamics, enormous ranges of emotion. And I think it's one of the most moving pieces around the whole civil rights movement, ironically enough made by a Canadian, but nonetheless. In summing this record up, I'm not going to get into whether this is Peterson's best record because there's plenty of competition for that, but it is for good reason one of his most popular, not just because musically it's accessible even to the most casual of jazz fans, but also because of the quality of the playing. The emotional dial on this record is cranked far higher than on lots of his other work, and so the excitement here is available in lots of different colors, particularly on that amazing final track. It's an unabashedly pleasing oasis in an otherwise anarchic and boundary-trashing world of 1960s jazz, and it's well worth acquiring. For me, it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.